At the heart of our concerns here at LICC is that ordinary Christians will be equipped to be disciples of Jesus wherever they are, in their everyday lives, on their everyday front lines. And part of that, of course, is knowing the times in which we live and understanding, if you like, how the cultural waves that lap on our shores today have often been generated at a time and a distance in the past. And one of the currents, of course, that we've been experiencing in recent years is the so-called new atheism, which has become increasingly visible and increasingly vocal. But the voices and the faces of the new atheists we encounter today have tangled roots in the history of Western thought going back several centuries. And it's those roots that Nick so helpfully untangles in his latest book, Atheists, The Origin of the Species. Nick, as I'm sure many of you will know, is the author of loads of reports and a growing number of significant books which fall into this sweeping history of ideas, overviews that are so helpful for the rest of us. So thank you, Nick, for the work that you do. This latest book on atheists has been widely and overall positively reviewed. The literary review called it empathetic and critical, sensible and balanced, which I don't think was damning with faint praise. And then reviewing it in The Guardian, Julian Baggini called it the kind of intelligent, thoughtful, sympathetic critic that atheists need, if only to remind them that belief in God does not necessarily require a loss of all reason. Well, if you're interested, we have copies of the book available this evening. The price on the cover is $16.99, but the price for this evening, and this evening only, is £12. So please pick up a copy before you leave if you're of a mind to do so. Nick is research director at Theos, the Religion and Society think tank. He's also visiting research fellow at the Faiths and Civil Society Unit, Goldsmiths, University of London. And if you're not familiar with the work of Theos, let me encourage you to check it out and perhaps to sign up for their weekly mailings. Their website is regularly updated, and it's a goldmine of tackling different issues of current concern from a Christian perspective, all of which seeks to operate, I think, with a level of civility that's necessary for engaging with the public square. So I do commend it to you. Nick used to work here at LICC some years back, before my time. I think we've just about forgiven him now, after all these years. But one of my colleagues who worked with Nick says that he was a very nice man. Truth be known, whenever Nick is spoken about, and he is still spoken about here in LICC, it's always in slightly hushed, reverent tones, especially for his capacity for work and his ability to write up something very quickly and very well. So there are lots of things that Nick can turn his hand to, but we've asked him this evening to talk about the topic of his latest book, Atheists, The Origin of the Species. So welcome with me, please, Nick Spencer. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be back. With a little trepidation when Anthony was talking there, and he said, when Nick's name is mentioned here, and I fully expect him to say people start crossing themselves and praying. But it's lovely to be back. I'm always bathed by a sense of peace and well-being when I return to LICC. But I'm reminded that things don't stand still. When I first joined about 12 or so years ago now, we were sending out lectures on cassette, and you wouldn't get biscuits at an event. So some things change, but there is progress in life too. I'm going to talk to you tonight for about, 50 minutes, I think, about Atheists, The Origin of the Species, and I want to begin with a fairy story. Once upon a time, there was a terrible monster that lived in the sky. No one had ever seen it because it lived a long way away and because it was invisible. But everyone knew it was there because a long time ago it had shown itself to some very clever men. These very clever men explained how the monster had one head, 3 bodies, and 1,000 eyes, with which it could see into people's souls. They told terrible tales of what the monster would do if it got angry, but also of how kind it was if people would only worship it without thought or question. They explained how the monster had given them a powerful magic, which, if used rightly, would protect the world from evil. Sometimes the monster would get angry, and when it did, the clever men would offer it sacrifices, dragging people into market squares where they would burn them alive, just to show the monster how much they loved it. The people listened to the very clever men and believed them, but they still yearned to be free of the monster. And then, one day, a few brave men, who had only ever pretended to believe in the monster, unearthed a chest of strange metal. The chest had been hidden by an earlier, wiser, freer people who had lived in the land before the monster came and had known a better way of life. Ever so slowly, the men began to work the metal, which they called reason, using it to forge a new weapon, which they called science. And they used science to attack the monster and very clever men. They had to be very careful at first, because if anyone was caught using science, they would be dragged into market squares where they would be burned alive. And indeed, this was how many, many men lost their lives. But these were brave men, not to be fooled by fables or cowed by threats. Their band multiplied and their weapons grew in number and power until one day a brilliant, reclusive rebel invented a super weapon, which he called evolution, which could punch clean through the monster's armored scales. After that, the attacks increased in frequency and ferocity until one day the rebels were able to show the people what they had long known themselves. The monster had never actually existed. It was just a tale told by the very clever men to keep themselves in riches and power. Slowly the truth spread, and although some very clever men still cling to riches and power, and some very stupid ones still believe them, gradually, wonderfully, the world is being set free. Every culture has its creation myth, and that is atheism's. They're ancient creation myths, except for the fact in this case it's probably only about 150 years old. And broadly speaking, that is the perception of how atheism evolved in Western Europe from about 1600 or so onwards. It was a question of reason and philosophy and science pushing back and killing the monster or the threat of religious faith. It has some truth in it. It's true enough to be believable, even if it's not true enough to be true. But it has passed into popular understanding as the history of atheism. And what I try and do in my book is to show that, in actual fact, it isn't the history of atheism. At best, it's a sideshow, it's a subplot. And that the history of atheism has very much more to do with social and political issues than it has to do with scientific and philosophical ones. What I will do is answer, in a sense, 2 questions. What is the real story? What is the real history of atheism? And how did we get to that story? Why was it that that particular creation myth developed when it did? And the first place to begin is about 500 years ago, in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages had a very rich and thick language for heresy. There were lots of different theologically nuanced words to describe people who didn't believe in the orthodox truth. But it had no word for atheism. The word atheism, as we now know it, first emerged in French and English in the first half of the 16th century. At that time, when the word was first coined, people believed there were atheists everywhere. Marin Mersenne, who was a very brilliant French theologian, philosopher, and mathematician around the beginning of the 17th century, claimed that there were as many as 50,000 atheists in Paris. A discourse on the present state of England, which was a report to Lord Burleigh in 1572 here, claimed that the realm is divided into three parties: the Papists, the Atheists, and the Protestants. The term itself was endlessly passed. One Jesuit identified 5 different kinds of atheism. There's furious and enraged atheism. I'm not going to make any obvious comments on that. We'll come to the digs later, don't worry. There's furious and enraged atheism. There's the atheism of libertinage and corruption of manners. There's the atheism of profanation. There's the wavering or unbelieving atheism, and then there's the brutal, lazy, melancholy atheism. 5 was relatively economical. Some people went up to 10, 12, 13. But the most significant division, which you see in literature across the continent in the 17th century, was the division between practical atheism and theoretical atheism. Practical atheism meant living like an atheist, and I'll come back to what that means in a minute. Theoretical atheism means thinking like an atheism, not cognitively registering the existence of a God. The word was used very widely, but it was used in a way that would confuse us today. It was used of people who allegedly denied divine providence. So you could believe in God, but if you were in any way questionable about divine providence, I could call you an atheist. People who allegedly, again, there's a lot of allegedlys here because these are all accusations, as you'll understand at the time. People who denied God's involvement in the world were called atheists. People who denied the immortality of the soul. People who denied the existence of hell and heaven. People who denied the doctrine of creation. People who denied the existence of a spirit world. Very importantly, it was used by Catholics of Protestants who denied the authority of God's representative on earth in Rome. And it was used by Protestants of Catholics who evaded and ignored God's word in Scripture by placing their trust in a worldly authority in Rome. In other words, the word atheist could be used to denote any heterodox belief, anything that smelled even a little bit like the denial of God. It was thrown about with about as much abandonment as commie was during the McCarthy years, and to an exactly similar effect. Because if someone called you a communist in post-war America, they weren't making a statement narrowly about your political ideology. They were making a statement about your entire value system and the extent to which that value system was a threat to our way of life. And that is what atheism was in the 16th and 17th century. John Redwood, who will be familiar to many of you as a conservative politician, before he was a conservative politician, was a fine historian, and he wrote a book on reason, ridicule, and religion in England around the 17th century. And he wrote this at one point: "Whenever a man took up his pen and attempted to write about the weather, the seasons, the structure of the earth, the constitution of the heavens, the nature of political society, the organization of the church, social morality or ethics, he was, by definition, taking up his pen to write about God." This was one of the reasons why there was no word for atheist in the medieval period. The Christian culture of Europe was so thick, so total, so all-encompassing, that it was literally impossible to conceive of an entirely alternative view. Everything, the way we lived, what we hoped for, how we structured society, everything was predicated on the existence of God. Without God, Milton wrote, there would be no distinction between right and wrong. The estimate of virtue would entirely depend on the blind opinion of men. The English Chief Justice wrote in 1676, to dissolve all those obligations whereby the civil societies, atheism would dissolve all those obligations whereby civil societies are preserved. Oaths are key here. Public and social order depended on justice. And justice depended on functioning judicial proceedings. Functioning judicial proceedings depended on veracity, people telling the truth. And veracity depended on reliable oaths. And reliable oaths depended on what they were sworn on. So if you take away the God, or the scripture, or the revelation on which oaths are sworn, you can't believe anybody anymore. We've lost our moral code. We've lost the structure of obedience that allows society to function. Voltaire put it this way. Voltaire, interestingly, was a deist. Voltaire was almost as anti-atheist as many of the Catholics amongst whom he lived, but from a very different perspective. And he wrote, Italy in the 15th century was full of atheists. And what was the consequence? Cases of poisoning were as common as invitations to supper. So, if the word atheism is bandied about in the 17th century, it begs the question, was it just bandied about? Were there any atheists at the time? Well, in a sense, we can go back before the Renaissance and the Reformation to pick up views that certainly are flavoured like atheism. In the early 11th century, two clergymen in Orleans insisted that the universe had existed from eternity, that heaven and hell were fictions, and the Trinity was incoherent. Heresy registers across Europe, certainly from the 14th century onwards, include at least accusations of religious skepticism, materialism, and disbelief. The problem we have, of course, is almost all of it is accusations. If you wanted to discredit anybody, hint that they were unorthodox. But occasionally we get first-hand evidence. Thomas Cima was accused of lollardy in the mid-15th century, but he appeared to be guilty of a great deal worse. He publicly denied the existence of soul, of heaven, of hell, purgatory. He claimed that Jesus was nothing but a man born of Joseph and Mary. He said that the Eucharist was nothing more than bread. As far as he was concerned, the Bible was a set of prescriptions for human behaviour devised to keep the peace. Remarkably, Thomas Cima died a natural death. So lots of people were accused, and there certainly were atheistic views of that nature. But what happens in the 16th and 17th century is that they slowly cohere. They come together into something that's more coherent and more functioning as a belief system. And they do so because it's during this period that Europeans get glimpses of other worlds. They get their first proper glimpses of the ancient world. Now, of course, the ancient world had been known about in various different forms and had been, in a sense, once rediscovered in the 13th century, and classical texts were being unearthed by humanist scholars in monasteries across Europe from the 14th and 15th century onward. And as the Ottoman Empire pressed westwards, Greek scholars left Constantinople and Greece, and they very often carried previously unknown manuscripts in their bags. So gradually into the 15th century, Europe became more aware of its classical past. And one of the most crucial volumes that was discovered at the time was Lucretius's poem on the nature of things, discovered in a German monastery in 1432. And this was pretty much totally unknown beforehand, and it was completely unfamiliar to the European mind at the time, and more important than that, almost impossible to reconcile with any idea of Christianity. This is a world of atoms, of pure chance. It is actually a world of gods, but they're totally distant gods. They have no involvement whatsoever with human nature. And most importantly, the world as people saw it had no creator, had no designer, had no plan. Now, these were extremely subversive views, but they're picked up and they're used. Montaigne refers to Lucretius repeatedly at the end of the 16th century. You get a vision of a way that these atheist views might slot into another system. There is, of course, the discovery of the Americas in the late 15th, early 16th century, and a greater degree of contact with civilizations in the Far East that had hitherto been known about by rumour, if that's all, if that. And what these cultures did was relativize European culture. People came across, for a start, cultures that were primitive, at least according to Europeans at the time, but didn't seem to have any coherent belief in God. And one of the premises was that belief in God was just automatic. And then they came across very sophisticated, very ancient cultures in the Far East that again seemed to believe in God, but it was very difficult to square any of that belief with any kind of natural theology. And later on in the 18th century, there's a very big battle around whether Confucianism is a theistic system or not. All this does is relativize and just slowly move the ground from underneath our feet. Pierre Charon, who was a disciple of Montaigne and a now unknown writer, but at the time quite influential, wrote this: one's nation, one's country, one's home determines one's religion. We are circumcised or baptized Jews or Muslims or Christians before we know we are human beings. It is not we who choose our religions. If religion was of divine establishment, he wrote, shining out with God's glory, it would solidly be established in our hearts and would have consequences that would seem and would indeed be miraculous. There were inner worlds that would open up. The name probably most associated with atheism in the 16th century is Machiavelli. In the prologue to Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, we hear the lines, I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance. Might first made kings, and laws were then most sure when, like the Dracos, they were writ in blood. Now, why Machiavelli is important is because too many people recognize what he was writing about, particularly in The Prince. There's a painful honesty, this cold and amoral, immoral realpolitik that he, as a diplomat himself, revealed as being at the heart of so many machinations. The fear of our early European forebears was that justice and right were an illusion, and we lived in a world, in a universe, where only might, only power dictated what would happen. That was the atheistic world that people feared. But most importantly, in terms of these new worlds, there was the divided world, the division of Christendom. And this created a massive ideological, spiritual, epistemological, political, social earthquake which tore Europe apart and really prepared the ground for atheism. See, even after the machinations in the early part of the 16th century, there was agreement that authority, how we knew what we knew about the world, and political authority, how we should rule the world, it was still founded on God's revelation in the Bible. Whether you were Catholic or Protestant, that was the sine qua non. The problem was, who interpreted the Bible? Was it the individual conscience, or the Holy Spirit living in the individual, as the Protestant reformers insisted it was? Or was it the church and the tradition and the church fathers and the magisterium, as the Catholics insisted it was? Huge amounts of energy were expanded at the time, with Protestants trying to undermine Catholics, calling them atheists, I mentioned earlier, and Catholics undermining Protestants. Catholics said to Protestants, you're Protestants, you each interpret the Bible according to the Holy Spirit within you, but is it not somehow difficult that you interpret it differently to you? And the Protestants shot back at the Catholics, well, who is to say that church tradition is infallible? Scripture might be infallible, but why is it the people you trust to interpret Scripture are infallible? Why are you resting all your trust in Tertullian as opposed to the Scripture itself? And as it happened, later on, the early atheists picked up these arguments that the Protestants and the Catholics had been throwing at one another in the late 16th century, and then used them to undermine the whole shop. At the same time, more seriously, people started to dig around in Scripture. Now, this was not an atheistic activity at all. The greatest piece of biblical criticism from the 16th century is Erasmus's Greek publication, the Novum Testament, in 1513. And it's a very brilliant piece of scholarship. But what it does to a culture that is imbued with the Vulgate, this 4th century Latin translation, is to say there is a text behind the text that you're all familiar with, and not all the words that you are familiar with in the text actually mean what they mean in the original. And this was, of course, something that Luther and the Reformers picked up on. And if they did that with the New Testament, it was even more of a case with the Old Testament, which, as scholars increasingly were public about, has no vowels, and so there is a question about interpretation and where the vowel points are. Now, that is all quite serious, if you like, that collective undermining, but what, of course, did for it was the fact that theological alignments became, broadly speaking, political alignments, and confessional blocs emerged across Europe. And people started metaphorically fighting one another in terms of their scholarly engagement with Scripture, but it wasn't very long before they were actually fighting one another. Now, it's not the case that the so-called wars of religion are entirely about religion. Different confessions fought against the same people fought against people of the same confession according to political allegiance. It never separated very simply along confessional lines. But in the European imagination afterwards, Europe had been brought to easily its most bloody conflict until the 20th century, and possibly even, including the 20th century, by confessional antagonism. And this is where science enters the story, because if I can't quite trust what I had heretofore trusted to know about the world and to know about authority, maybe science can do the trick. Now, it is incredibly important to register at this point that science, completely in contradiction to the fairy story with which I started off, is not an atheistic enterprise. It is a Christian enterprise. It's got biblical Christianity stamped all over it. Francis Bacon, for as the Psalms and other scriptures do invite us to consider and magnify the great and wonderful works of God, if we should rest only in the contemplation of the exterior of them, as they first offer themselves to our senses, we should do a like injury unto the majesty of God. In other words, by studying nature, you do justice to God's glory and magnificence. Our Saviour saith, you err, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. In doing so, he lays before us 2 books or volumes to study if we are to be secured from error. First, the Scriptures, revealing the will of God, and then the creatures expressing his power. The motivation to study the natural world, natural theology, as it was, of course, called then, not called science for at least another century or so, was very profoundly biblical. And it's here that the quotation that's attributed to Galileo, but it's actually from Cardinal Cesare Borromeo, comes. The Scriptures might tell us how to go to heaven. Sorry, the Scriptures tell us how to go to heaven rather than how the heavens go. The problem was, so this is all in the 17th century Christianity and well into the 18th century Christianity and science. There is no tension there at all. The idea of historic warfare is completely anachronistic. But there are the seeds of conflict then. Because if you start thinking that science can tell you how to go to heaven as well as how the heavens go, if you start thinking that science can tell you everything you need to know about God, that reason will give you enough, you don't need revelation, which is all contentious and difficult. If you start believing that, you're going to get disappointed. And that's what happens in the beginning of the 19th century, and that's where the Darwin story comes in. So what you get into the 17th century then is these atheistic views slowly coming together, and they come together to form a more coherent whole. And in particular, they come together in three thinkers that I don't have time to go into a great deal, but one is Thomas Hobbes, a very brilliant and very entertaining English sort of early scientist and most famous as a political writer for his book Leviathan, which he published in 1651. Hobbes hated scholasticism, the kind of Aristotelian logic chopping that dominated Oxford University, which is where he went in the 17th century. He fell in love with geometry and Euclid, and he was a materialist as well. Although quite what Hobbes believes is always a little bit difficult to pin down. As well as that, he is what I believe. People, when you read Thomas Hobbes, or read about Thomas Hobbes, you will get people who say, Thomas Hobbes was an atheist. And then you get respectable scholars who say Thomas Hobbes was Christian, no doubt about it. And you get every possible point in the spectrum between the two, which is one of the reasons why he's such an interesting thinker. He's very difficult to pin down. For my money, he's a kind of deeply attenuated Christian, but I think he's an Erastian, someone who believes that the state should rule the church. And part 3 of Leviathan is a big exercise in drawing the political teeth of the church. He's writing it in the civil wars when Puritans are, as far as he's concerned, bringing the kingdom into complete disrepute. So what he wants to do is draw the political teeth of the church, and he does so by systematically just nibbling away at scripture and at ideas of revelation. So he says at one point, to say God had spoken to a man in a dream is no more to say that he dreamed that God spoke to him. And it's full of little kind of undermining like that. So not surprisingly, Hobbes is known as an atheist, a big atheist at the end of the 17th century. Similarly, Spinoza, over in the Netherlands, a brilliant scholar and a brilliant Old Testament scholar as well, who has a naturalistic worldview and spends lots of time picking at the Old Testament. But perhaps most importantly, as far as people are concerned, Spinoza is actually a good guy. People can accuse Hobbes, and do accuse Hobbes of all sorts of things, but it's very difficult to accuse Spinoza of anything because he's kicked out of his synagogue, and he spends the rest of his short life grinding lenses for a living and writing and publishing anonymous philosophical tracts. He's not the atheist of Christian terror. He's a good guy. And that brings me to the third person with whom atheism kind of coalesces the view. He's a guy called Pierre Bayle, who lives at the end of the 17th century. He's born a Protestant, he converts to Catholicism, then he converts back to Protestantism, which in France at the end of the 17th century was not a clever thing to do. So he has to leave, and he goes and works in Rotterdam. Leibniz once commented that if you asserted something in conversation with Bayle, Bayle would analyse it and question it until you were ready to give up or assert its opposite, at which point Bayle would analyse that and persuade you to give up your second position as well. He was contrary in the extreme. And this is borne out by the fact that he is what we would call today a fideist, so someone who believes that reason cannot tell you anything about religious belief. It's all down to revelation or faith. Now, there are some very respectable philosophers who will hold that position, but the way Bayle described it is, Christianity, religion is irrational. Reason will not get you anywhere near to God. And whereas he's got a kind of sophisticated theological argument that can defend that, people get a bit fed up with it after a while. Because you get the sense he's actually not making this point, he's actually making the point that religion is simply wrong. But more important, and part of Bayle's perversity, is he makes the case that there were good atheists. It has been asserted, he wrote, that a mere atheist would be a monster beyond the power of nature to create. I reply that it is not more strange for an atheist to live virtuously than for a Christian to abandon himself to crime. And you can give quite a few examples to back him up. It seems, to us, an utterly incontrovertible point. But if your belief is predicated on the fact that atheism is somehow innately immoral because it doesn't have God's moral system to guide and inspire and encourage, having someone saying, no, you don't need it, we can have a good society of atheists, that's profoundly undermining. So my argument is that there's nobody of whom you can say uncontrovertibly, was an atheist in Europe until about 1720. I'll come on to who that was in a second. But you get lots and lots of atheist views. You get lots of accusations of atheism, you get lots of analysis of atheism, and throughout that period you get these atheist views coalescing into a view that's best represented by someone like Hobbes or Spinoza or perhaps Bayle, where it becomes a coherent system. That's how atheism intellectually emerges in the 16th and 17th century. Then is the question, this is the second part I want to go into, the different paths it subsequently takes. And you can pick this up by looking at 3 case studies from the 18th century. Look at Britain, late 17th, 18th century. There are 2. The atheistic tradition doesn't emerge in Britain until there's a pamphlet published in 1788 where this guy, anonymously, wisely, says, "Be it here known that on the whatever it is of June 1788, to future generations, an atheist did live in Britain." It's the first person who actually kind of outs himself. And you have some pretty sceptical people in 18th century Britain. You have David Hume and Edward Gibbon, not least, and there are others. But it never emerges in the way it does in France. Why doesn't it emerge? Well, 2 particular reasons. The science is the first one. The Royal Society is founded in 1660, and slightly bizarrely, someone writes a biography of it 7 years later. Bishop Thomas Sprat, explaining that the Royal Society was cautious not to intermeddle in spiritual things. And people have taken that to mean, Royal Society, this is science, and religion is separate, it goes over there. But in actual fact, that's not true at all. The Charter in 1663 declared that the Society's activity should be devoted to the glory of God the Creator, and its officers were required to swear an oath on the Gospels. What the Royal Society didn't want to get involved with was confessional battles, denominational battles, founded in 1660 after 20 years of civil war and Commonwealth. They wanted to avoid these contentious confessional issues and focus on what we would subsequently call science, but that is not science in tension with Christianity at all. And a number of very prominent figures in the end of the 17th century, supremely Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, are very public about how their science, their natural theology, is not only wholly compatible with Christianity, but a support for it. And Boyle founds what is known as the Boyle Lectures, which are lectures in natural theology that go on for 200 years and have recently been resurrected in the last 10 years in the city, which were intended for the defense of the Christian religion against atheists and other believers. The first one is delivered by Richard Bentley. It's called The Confutation of Atheism, and Bentley explicitly draws on Isaac Newton's work, so there's the sense that this new scientific enterprise is wholly compatible with Christianity. You don't have to choose one or the other. And equally important, in 1688 is the Act of Toleration passed. And for the first time, there is a measure of toleration politically and socially in Britain. Now, it's not toleration as we would understand it. It's very circumscribed toleration, but compared to pretty much everywhere else in Europe, there is toleration there. And crucially importantly, there is a stream of anti-clerical thought that is permitted in the dissenters. If you loathed your local Anglican priest, you could become a dissenter. You could stay within the fold. You wouldn't have to leave and criticize from the outside. And that drew the sting of the inevitable criticism that there was of the Anglican Church. So the result of all this is that in 17th century into 18th century Britain, there's a lot of wriggle room. There's a lot of, comparatively, socially and intellectually, you can embrace new ideas and intellectual and political toleration without feeling it's in tension with the official Christianity of the country. Not so in France. Louis XIV revokes the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which is about 100 years old at that time, which had been an edict tolerating French Protestants, and gives French Protestants the opportunity, the choice, really, to convert or to leave or to be executed. One of those three. Not a great choice, really, and an awful lot of them, the famed Huguenot weavers, come over to Britain. This is actually partly part of the at the time English and subsequent British identity at the time. To be English and then to be British was to not be French. It was incredibly important because the French tolerated persecuted Protestants because they read the Word of God, whereas our identity would be the toleration of allowing people to read the Word of God, even in dissenting chapels. So there was that self-conscious identification with toleration over here, whereas in France, you didn't get any of that. Louis XIV became ever more pious towards the end of his very long reign, and he banned many of the entertainments he had previously enjoyed. He forbade the teaching of Cartesianism, so the teaching of René Descartes in French colleges and universities, and enforced what was already by then an outdated form of Aristotelianism. In any case, all that philosophy was suborned to theology, so there is a kind of a rigid, oppressive, anti-intellectual climate there. The French church, of course, is fabulously wealthy, owns something like 10% of the land and exercises the right to tithe over the rest of it. There is a moderate loosening of these social and political and intellectual cords when Louis dies in 1715, but it's not a great deal. And at least Louis was pious. You know, his successors and the French nobles hardly bothered to hide their libertine contempt for Christianity. It's said that his successor, Philippe, had the works of Rabelais bound into his Bible so he could read them during Mass. That was the culture. As late as 1766, there were still people being publicly tortured for confessional crimes in France. There is no wriggle room there. There is no flexibility. If you have problems, and you should really have problems with the way that Christianity is formed in early 18th century France, you can't do it from within the church, intellectually or even socially. And it's in this context that we can say we know the first incontrovertible atheist in modern European history. He's a guy called Jean Meslier. He's born in 1664. He dies, I think, in about 1725, and he's a priest. It's a lovely detail. He takes holy orders in 1689, and he lives a thoroughly indifferent life. No one would have heard anything more about him until they found under his bed, when he died, a manuscript, 500-page manuscript, actually 3 versions of it, which he had been furiously scribbling for many years, which gave clear and evident demonstrations of the vanity and falsity of all the gods and all the religions of the world. So difficult to kind of work your way around that one. The memoir, or testament as it's more often known, makes the God delusion seem sober and fair and reasonable. It is extraordinarily vitriolic. Early on in it, Meslier wrote that how a man with neither science nor education, but who did not lack common sense, once told him that he wished all the greats of the earth and all the nobles were hung and strangled with the entrails of priests. And it's from that the more famous Diderot quote comes from, "It won't rest until the body of the last king is swinging from the guts of the last priest," or something like that. That's the introduction. That's just getting going. You wait till he really kind of goes for it. Now, as it happens, Meslier is not particularly important in the story because Voltaire gets hold of his manuscript, and Voltaire doesn't need any excuse to give the Catholic Church a kicking, but he fears atheism just as much. So he doctors, basically. He republishes the Testament as a deistic tract rather than an atheistic tract. He keeps all the anti-clerical stuff going in it. But Meslier is known for the 18th century primarily as a deistic thinker, someone who believes in the existence of God, but not in his intervention, not in the revelation of the God of the Bible. But where Meslier trod, others followed, if unconsciously, and you get characters that I think will be quite familiar to you, people like Diderot and the Baron Holbach. Baron Holbach is an extremely wealthy French aristocrat who holds this table, this salon, in Paris from 1750 to about 1770, around which the great and the good, and they really are the intellectual kind of heavyweights of Europe, gather and talk about the new knowledge and new science, and of course gather to take chunks out of Christianity. There's the story of David Hume, when he was an ambassador to Paris, dining there and saying innocently that he didn't believe that there were actually any true atheists. At one point, the Baron leant back and said, "Look around you, how many people are there, monsieur?" And he says, 18. He said, "Well, you can start with 15, and we're not sure about the other 3. This was an extremely, extremely sceptical, and above all, extremely angry group of people, because they had a lot to be angry about. And this is where the paths diverge. The wells of moral indignation were deep in 18th century France. People living in a culture of intellectual, social, and political oppression that was fully backed up by the church. That gave good grounds for atheistic sentiments. Not so in Britain, for the reasons I've outlined, and even less so in America. Third brief case study from the time. Of course, from the founding origins of America, right at the British part of America, I should say, in the 17th century, there's obviously a self-conscious Christianity to it. And perhaps most importantly, many American clergy enthusiastically supported the revolution. So Christianity became associated with in many people's minds with political emancipation in a way that it wasn't very often in Europe. So you have this kind of Christian culture. You balance that with the fact that there is this very live debate about the quote-unquote faith of the founding fathers, and whereas some like John Witherspoon and John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice, and Samuel Adams were undoubtedly Christians, others like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, you get to deism at best, I think. But most importantly, the Constitution doesn't refer to God, except as in the year of our Lord at one point. It precludes any religious test from becoming a requirement for office, and most famously in the First Amendment, it legislates against Congress making any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof. Clerics cannot get their hands on power. Now, many people would have lamented that at the time, but it meant that whereas those wells of deep moral indignation were deep in France and relatively shallow in Britain, they're almost non-existent in America. There's deistic thought, and Thomas Paine is obviously quite influential around the time, but there is no sense that we live in a culture or a polity that's oppressed either intellectually or politically, let alone for Christian reasons. And this is very important because, of course, as the 19th century goes into the 20th century, America becomes the most self-consciously modern, technologically adept society on earth. If the theory science equals atheism were good, America would be streets ahead of everywhere else. But it's the dog that doesn't bark. So we move into the 19th century. What time should I be packing in, by the way? Because I could go on for ages. 10 minutes, okay. 2 centuries in 10 minutes. This is like that Monty Python thing, summarise Proust in 15 seconds. Okay, you move into the 19th century, and the best way of thinking about the 19th century is the whole thing is lived in the shadow of the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution is not actually particularly atheistic. There is the cult of the supreme being, the cult of reason, and of course, Christian calendar is abolished, Christian holidays are abolished, churches are trashed, and priests are killed, but not, for the most part, in the name of atheism or godlessness, in the name of reason. And the French Revolution obviously shakes all of Europe, and different cultures respond to it in different ways, respond to religiously in different ways. So starting with France itself, you have the intellectuals from the 1820s onwards who believe that somehow or other the chaos and carnage and humiliation of the last 20 years was the result of the philosophers, of the people who sat around Holbach's table. And that is something to be avoided. At the same time, the new questions that they were asking and posing about the world hadn't been answered. And there is a resurgent and somewhat triumphant Catholicism in France in the early years of the 19th century. So where do people go there? They don't want to go back to the old, dry, rationalistic and frankly slightly dangerous kind of philosophy. We can't embrace the triumphant and resurgent Catholicism. So you get what is effectively Catholicism minus God. And several thinkers, probably best known are Henri Saint-Simon and a guy called Auguste Comte. Comte in particular forms what's known as the religion of humanity. It's Saint-Simon who's the more original thinker, and he, parasiting on Christian thought, divides the history of the world up into three different kind of eras. There's the religious era, the metaphysical era, then there's the scientific era. And societies pass through each as they progress to something that is better and higher and more noble. And he wrote a book called New Christianity in 1825, which basically tried to replace the deity with humanity. And that's the second big theme from the 19th century, retaining the religious Christian structure, but knocking God off the top and placing mankind there in his place. And what Auguste Comte does is he does that, but he develops a fully fledged religion of humanity, which is hard to distinguish from insanity at times. Positivists, as they were known, were to pray 3 times a day, once to each of his household goddesses, mother, wife, and daughter. He had to cross himself by tapping his head with his finger 3 times in the place where, according to phrenology, the impulses of benevolence, order, and progress were to be found. The religion had 9 sacraments, beginning with presentation, which is kind of baptism, initiation, admission, destination, marriage at a specified age, maturity, retirement, transformation, and then 7 years after death, incorporation. And it went on and on and on. And there are actually still some positivist churches in existence, although I think they're in South America rather than anywhere in Europe. So that is a kind of oversimplifying greatly where French atheistic thought goes in the 19th century. German atheistic thought is more influential. Germans react against the French Revolution as all of Europe do, and they place national sentiments over and against the kind of the universalism that was supposedly underpinning the French Revolution, and German idealism against French materialism. This is where you get into Hegel and the young Hegelians, which is incredibly complicated, he says, because I never really understand Hegel, I have to say this. But it's very influential because it posits the idea of a spirit, the spirit of an age, of a time, ultimately of the world, which progresses and develops, perhaps not smoothly, perhaps with conflicts and with deviations, but the idea that the world is moving forward in the way that Saint-Simon thought it was moving forward, but by Hegel's calculation on a more philosophically robust and respectable way. And he is convinced that his thought is kind of laden with Christian ideas and imagery, and he is convinced he's kind of managed to bridge that gap between Christianity and the philosophy of the 18th century, except the fact that it's not Christianity as anyone would really recognize it. He is followed by people who are called the young Hegelians, and they start in his slipstream, but they start going in a very radical direction, and they publish books like The Essence of Christianity by Ludwig Feuerbach and The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. And this is the higher criticism. This is, for the first time in Europe, you get critical analysis of the New Testament. And this is the thing that rocks faith in the 19th century far more so than Darwinism ever really does. It's picking apart the New Testament. And these early works from the 1830s arguing that Jesus was actually only a person, only a human being, and the disciples were misunderstood him. But again, my theme that it's always social, society and politics that are influential here comes in again. And in the 1830s, 2 out of every 5 graduates from German universities studied theology, but the number of ecclesiastical and academic roles was limited, and was limited to those who were of a conservative theological and political disposition. So you had this kind of wide range of educated, theologically literate, but unemployed, and in some cases unemployable graduates, who were also disaffected with the political culture of the time, and it's they who start to rebel against Christianity in Germany, and it's here. This is the school that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels emerged from. Sorry, I'm rushing through this, I apologise. In Britain, there is again reaction to the French Revolution, and for the first 20 or 30 years or so, you have political oppression. So Britain becomes more politically oppressive in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, and the ruling political economy, so a free market economy as we would call it, which created a very angry, very poor underclass. And even though this underclass is somehow fed a little bit by some forms of Christianity, particularly primitive Methodism, atheism in 19th century Britain is a working class phenomenon more than any other. It's not a particularly intellectual phenomenon. The action comes from people who see in the established church indifference to their plight. I should, I think, say a word on Darwin, because I'm incapable of doing a talk on anything without talking about Darwin at some point. And my point earlier on that atheism in Britain, indeed the rest of the world, has not a great deal to do with Darwinism. Of course, there's some truth in that, and there's some truth in the idea that people did become atheists because of Darwin, but much, much, much less than you would expect from the polemic today. Darwin himself famously was training for the clergy until he managed to get a place on the Beagle. And he had a Christian faith, but it was a very particular natural theological Christian faith. It was the kind of Christian faith that was best proved, and ideally proved from the study of nature. And it is that was unpicked by his scientific endeavours, and supremely, actually, the death of Annie, his daughter, in 1851, over in Great Malvern. She was 10 years old, she was his favourite child, and very unusually for the Victorian father, he was there throughout the whole agonising 10 days in Easter 1851. I've read the letters he wrote back to Emma over in Down in Kent, which he writes 3 times a day, talking about the small signs that Annie has rallied. And then it's an emotional roller coaster. It's quite extraordinary and very, very moving. And it's that finally kills his Christian faith in 1851 or so. But Darwin himself never becomes an atheist. He's an agnostic. And he writes, toward the very end of his life, some of his last letters, I feel compelled to look for a first cause, having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to that of a man. And to that extent I deserve to be called a theist. But then, can the mind of a man, which has, as I fully believe, been developed from a mind as low as that possessed by the lowest animal, be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? So Darwin was an agnostic in a very profound sense. His look out at the cosmos, he was a theist. He believed that there was order and a first cause. He looked at nature, and he was an atheist. He couldn't see order and structure, let alone benevolence. And they pulled him in each direction. And then you have this kind of monkey issue right in the middle, where he said, well, can we even trust our minds anyway? This is actually a profound and very live philosophical issue. Do our minds detect truth? And Darwin said, well, can I trust my mind on these big metaphysical issues? I can't even trust the way I think. So Darwin was a profound agnostic. And the way he's been hijacked to be the kind of the poster boy of intelligent atheism today is deeply ironic. It's at this time, then, at the end of the 19th century, that the creation myth with which I started emerges. And it is partly to do with science, there's no pretending otherwise. But it's actually more to do with the fact that in 1869, I think it is, Pope Pius IX publishes his Syllabus of Errors, which concludes that the pontiff ought not to come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. And it's the age of the First Vatican Council which dogmatically defines the long-standing doctrine that when the Pope spoke ex cathedra in matters of faith or morals, he did so with Christ's gift of infallibility. So there's a kind of an intellectual assertion by the Vatican in the last third of the 19th century against modern trends of science and liberalism and progress. And it's that moment that you get these books charting, they're called, the history of the warfare with science and religion being published. And it's a beautiful irony there. So that book is by John William Draper, hugely influential. Its full title is The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And it charts how, from the days of Galileo, if not before, the Vatican, and it's primarily the Vatican he's got a problem with, has stood in the way of scientific progress and prevented intellectual endeavour and the freedom of thought, and has sought to ban these kind of things. So what does the Vatican do? It puts the book on its list of prohibited books, without any sense of irony, it seems. So that is the moment where this creation myth of where atheism comes from originates. Into the 20th century, you'll be pleased to hear that, seeing as we've only got 5 minutes left, you're going to be spared the horrors of the Gulag, because it takes up quite a large part of the last part of the book. The final section of the book is called Problems. And it argues that really the high point for atheism, this may seem a strange thing to argue today, the high point for atheism was around the end of the 19th century, possibly slightly later in Britain. But this is the time when you can convincingly, this is a hopeful time for atheism, you can convincingly stand up and say, human progress is being made. People are being politically and intellectually emancipated. If we can just throw off the yoke of backward-looking, conservative in the wrong sense of the word, ecclesiastical and theological straitjacket, we will become a freer, better, more tolerant world. Doesn't work out like that, particularly in the 20th century. First, you get Nietzsche, whom I won't talk about tonight, unless I'm asked questions about. He's not part of that movement, but what Nietzsche does is prick this atheistic balloon, because he makes the point that if you're throwing away Christian metaphysical foundations, you should jolly well throw away Christian ethics too. And it's a sleight of hand to try and get the Sermon on the Mount without the person who delivered it. And as far as Nietzsche's concerned, it's a jolly good thing too, because it is precisely, as he calls it, this slave morality, which he's using in quite a precise term, that has weakened and emaciated the human spirit. What Christianity did was to elevate the weak and the forgiving over the strong and the victorious. And if humanity is to reach its utmost potential, we need strength and victory, not weakness and vacillation. Life itself is essentially a process of appropriating, injuring, overpowering the alien and the weaker, oppressing, being harsh, imposing your own form, incorporating and at the very least exploiting. You've got to be slightly careful. Nietzsche can write very, very well, and you get the sense he's being carried away with himself at some point. And also, of course, famously, he does go mad. And there are signs of this in his later work in the 1880s. But nonetheless, there's enough undeniably sane work to identify this as a real problem laid at the door of atheism. You want to retain Christian ethics without Christianity. At the same time, British atheism died. The great Victorian historian of Victorian Britain, Owen Chadwick, once wrote that there was a moment in the 1880s that Britain almost went secular. It was the time when Charles Bradlaugh, who founded the National Secular Society, was elected for Parliament, constituency of Northamptonshire, and there was a big kerfuffle because you had to swear an oath, and initially he refused to, then he said he would, by which time Parliament said, well, I'm not interested. It's like a playground tiff. You can't come and sit down because we won't let you swear the oath. And there was something like half a dozen court cases, and it was 6 years or so before he could actually attain his seat. But after that moment, the secularist cause, as it was better known in Britain, died. And someone made the point that secularist organisations were, what's the phrase they used, were like saunas. That's right, they were very good to pass through, but not very good to live in. And what happened was that the sauna died away in the beginning of the 20th century, again because there's not a great deal for atheism to get its teeth into in British history at the time. It's very difficult to get very, very worked up by the Anglican Church or the nonconformist churches at the time. At least at the time, I reserve judgment subsequently. And so the ethical movement fades away, so British atheism slowly dies. You do get to one or two very prominent academic atheists, and Bertrand Russell was the most famous among them. G.E. Moore, a very brilliant analytic philosopher at Trinity College. And G.E. Moore described his atheism as this, I love this quote, I am an infidel and do not believe that God exists. and I think the evidence will justify my disbelief, just as I think there is no evidence for his existence. Just as I think there is no evidence for his existence, I think there is also no evidence that he does not exist. I am not an atheist in one sense. I do not deny that God exists. I do not believe that he does exist, but I also do not believe that he does not exist. It's kind of difficult to get really behind a position like that. Russell could rally the troops. G.E. Moore was passing the details. So very much, Russell is the kind of standard bearer for British atheism. But it's a pretty lonely standard for much of the 20th century. And then, of course, you get atheism in Russia, and I'm going to have to skip over this. Anthony mentioned Julian's review of my book, and it was a lovely review and really positive, but he makes the point that I dwell, perhaps at too much length, on the horrors of Soviet atheism in the 20th century, and I do a bit about Mao as well, and Albania. And I would have to dispute this, because the more I think about it, the more I think that if Christianity had been responsible, indirectly if you like, for as many deaths in the 20th century as atheism was, it would probably be illegal today. Now, this isn't to say that all the 20 million people that Stalin killed were believers, or he did so for reasons of belief. Of course not. Everybody got killed there. But the idea that you could go from 40,000 religious establishments in 1917, open, functioning, to 1,000 in 1940. That you could have thousands and thousands of churches destroyed. That you could have thousands, millions of people killed. That you'd have an organization called the Soviet League of the Militant Godless, which boasted 5.5 million members, but it was really... they were party members for the most part. 68 anti-religious seminaries. Rituals, atheistic rituals like Octobering and red weddings and civilian funerals. Icon corners in houses being replaced by godless corners. Slogans with a bizarrely modern ring to them. Science instead of religion. Destroying religion, we say study science. Religion is poison, protect your children. I wonder if Christopher Hitchens got his title from there. Terrorists in Cossacks. We want to sweep away everything that claims to be supernatural, so on and so forth. That's atheism. I'm not saying that all Soviets were motivated by that at all, but there was a very clear and very direct and very deliberate attempt to stamp out religious belief. Only, as one Russian put it at the time, religion is like a nail. The harder you hit it, the deeper it goes in. So in one sense, the worst thing that happened to atheism in the 20th century was getting power. And then the second worst thing that happened to atheism was losing it as well. And it's a slow and very painful process. There's a thaw during the Second World War, of course, when Stalin appeals to the patriarchs and to the Orthodox Church to support the war efforts. But then Khrushchev, in the post-war period, goes through another attempted persecution, was a persecution in the late 1950s. Orthodox churches are shut again and people are exiled. But slowly and reluctantly, there's the belief, that the recognition that it's not working. It's easy to close a church, it's relatively easy to kill a priest, but it's fiendishly difficult to get rid of actual religious belief. And Enver Hoxha found this in Albania, and Mao found it even more so in China. You can destroy a material culture of a religion, but religious belief is strangely persistent. So the story ends, and perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about new atheism in the Q&A, right at the end of the 20th century into the 21st century, when you get this extraordinary flowering of atheism. And I argue, and I think it's a reasonably sound argument, the reason why this is because history is kind of took an abrupt handbrake turn circa 1979. 1968, the sociologist Peter Berger writes, I predict that by the 21st century, religious believers will be huddled together in small sects to protect themselves against a worldwide secular culture. Even as sociological predictions go, that's a pretty bad one. And then what happens is you have the emergence of political evangelicalism in the US, first in Jimmy Carter and then, of course, through Reagan in 1980. You have the Iranian Revolution in 79. You have people in Britain burning books on public street in 1988 with satanic verses, something that hadn't happened for several hundred years, really. And then, of course, you get violent political Islamists killing people indiscriminately. And there's all of a sudden an awful lot to get angry about. But we will get angry about religion because it's a nicely broad phrase. Very difficult to get extremely angry about Methodists. But if you have a category like religion, which is so big, it contains Methodists at one end and Osama bin Laden at the other, one would assume it's not overly useful as a category. But that needn't be the issue, because religion, if we can so term it, therefore is poison, or it's intellectually vapid. And, that was a great spasm, if you like, in the noughties. My sense is it's passed to be replaced with what some commentators have uninventively called new atheism. Really got to come up with some better words, which according to Alain de Botton's book, Religion for Atheists, is where, it's all nonsense. We know it's nonsense, but it's nonsense that we can steal from. It's useful. But if the premise of the book is right, we'll see a lot more of atheism in the 21st century. And I'll read you the opening paragraph or two, so let me read you the last paragraph. Ludwig Wittgenstein once commented that doubt was essentially parasitic on faith. Doubting and non-doubting behaviour. There is only the first if there is the second. Atheism is not doubt. Indeed, some atheists, discussed in these pages, have been congenitally incapable of doubt, or at least self-doubt. Nonetheless, Wittgenstein's observation applies just as much to atheism as it does to its more uncertain cousin. After a troubled century in which its former promises not only failed to materialise, but mutated into regimes of oppression that not even the religious have managed to achieve, atheism seems to have a renewed future in the 21st century. But it does so largely because religion, in its various guises, is once again a dominant feature on our social, political, and intellectual landscapes. It's a pleasing irony with which to end. Atheism is here to stay because God is back. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Jack. Thanks very much for your speech. I really enjoyed it, and I say that as an atheist myself. It was really interesting to see the backstory of it all. I agreed with pretty much 95% of what you said, but around the gulags point, which you yourself said you skipped, I found that quite interesting because I got an implication that the oppression of Stalinism was perhaps a logical endpoint of sorts for atheism. And I was going to ask you, do you believe that communism and Stalinism is perhaps, the final evolution of atheism, or was atheism merely something adopted into communism? Because, of course, you have such movements as Christian socialism, which show, a quite different kind of synthesis. So I thought that'd be just a really interesting point, which I'd like to hear your opinion on.
Very good question. Thank you, Jack. So the simple answer is no. I would, under no circumstances, say that communism, let alone Stalinist communism, was the end point of atheism. What your question does do is point to something that I actually talk about a bit in the book and didn't talk about at all in the lecture tonight, for reasons of time, I guess, which is that we do ourselves a disservice to talk about atheism in the singular. We do much better to talk about atheisms. Now, the reason for that is some people would say, well, there's only one way of not believing in God. Atheism is atheism is atheism. And that's true in the seminar room. But because atheism developed in a very thick Christian context and culture, in which belief in God was not a theoretical thing, but helped inform everybody's total engagement with life, for atheism to have any purchase in public, it could never be, there is no God. It was always, there is no God, and therefore. Because anarchy appealed to nobody. So in order to win hearts and minds, atheists had to say, okay, there is no God, or the apparatus of Christianity is wrong, but In the light of that, we should ... And the atheisms come in what follows in that ... Some people argued, so I'll try and pick up one or two of the examples. So from the 18th century, a guy called Helvetius argues that there is no God, therefore no heaven, and we must build heaven on earth, and we do so through education. Children, and indeed adults in some sense, are malleable, and if we get the right kind of knowledge in them, we will have a good society. There were some, like a guy called Lamettrie, who lived in the middle of the 18th century, who was equally atheistic, although he was detested by the other philosophers at the time, because he said, there is no God, and therefore pleasure is the only means of human good, and therefore we should just seek pleasure wherever. And they hated that because that confirmed the accusations of libertinism. There were some atheists, I haven't even mentioned Jeremy Bentham, and he'd be most famous, in which they would say, there is no God, and therefore happiness is the only measure. There's no heaven, so we should seek to follow people, to build up people's happiness on earth. So it's a much more sophisticated version than the Mettrie's pleasure. There was some, John Stuart Mill kind of falls into this, but he's more theistically flavoured, in which you say there is no God, and therefore there is no absolute morality. People have different conceptions of the good, and therefore we need to try and build a liberal society where each of us can build up our own conception of the good. And finally, there's actually others, but for the sake of this argument, there is no God and no heaven, therefore we must build heaven on earth, and we'll do so through political and scientific and technological means, and that was communism, and taken to its extreme, that ended up in the Gulag. So the more detailed answer to your question is that the logical endpoint, the extreme logical endpoint of one of those subtypes of atheism leads towards that view. But certainly not for all of them, because it's best to talk about atheisms than one.
Hello, so my name's Guy. I'm coming from the opposite spectrum to Jack. I was picking up on the point that where you linked the rise of atheism to a sense of indignation against the kind of political power that the church at the time had, particularly in France. And at the risk of opening an absolute can of worms, I wondered if you'd comment on the links or the relationship between the church and power in today's age, and whether you think that's more likely to foster Christianity or whether it's more likely to foster atheism.
I think that's the kind of the polite way of putting the question. The other way of putting it is, are you anti-establishment then? As a Christian, are you anti-establishment or anti the establishment? You could build that argument. So you could build the argument that if you wanted to minimize atheism, if that was your overriding objective in designing a polity, what you would do is get clerics out of power in any way, shape or form, and that includes even the kind of slightly attenuated, bizarre form of establishment we have today. I can respect that argument. It isn't mine, partly because minimizing atheism should not be the objective of any polity. If you're designing your polity in order to minimize the number of atheists there, you've got a quite wrong idea of what politics is for. And the second thing is that we treat establishment as if it's one thing and disestablishment as if it's another, and it's a binary choice. In actual fact, it's very much more complicated than that. And you can have forms of establishment that are compatible with more or less complete political democratic freedom, just as you can have forms of establishment that are incompatible with it. Every couple of years or so, the Economist Intelligence Unit produces a report called the Democracy Index, which tracks the democratic health of 180 nations worldwide, and it separates them into 4 different categories, the first one of which is fully functioning democracies. And these are the countries where, according to the EIU and the data it uses, there is more or less, not complete, but pretty robust, fair political democratic freedom. Britain is in there, although not at the top, as are about 8 or 9 other countries that have established churches. So in terms of the data, it is possible to have a fully functioning, non-oppressive political democracy and an established church. Having said all that, speaking again entirely personally, this isn't where I'd start from. I think it's what we've got, and as a system, I think it's reasonably good. But if we were, for my money, designing the constitution, so to speak, from scratch, even putting aside what our objective was, I wouldn't design the system we have at the moment.
Okay, someone else. Thank you. Yeah. Over there and then there.
Thank you. Very nice talk. I was just wondering about, you said about the training of German theologians, and you made the point that the overtraining of German theologians led to a lot more atheism spreading. I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that. Is that saying that we shouldn't train people?
I don't think I used the word overtraining. If I did, I didn't mean to. It wasn't the fact that the young Hegelians, as they were called, were overtrained. It was the fact they were trained and then underemployed. So they were, they got a very good grounding. They were taught to think and think very well, and then they were evicted. Well, they were either not admitted in the first instance, or they were evicted from more or less any position that would have allowed them to think, because the people they wanted in those positions were more to the liking of the political authorities. And that was the danger. It's not that they were too bright or overeducated, it's that they were well-educated and then sort of ignored, disposed of, bypassed.
Okay. We had something down here.
Hi. I was really interested with what you were talking about, how atheism is more to do with sort of political rebellion rather than to do with science and reason. I think you may have sort of covered this briefly, but how much do you think that means that many, well, particularly today, self-professed atheists, what they don't believe in is actually more the church and, religious believers than the idea of God itself?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I should say I made this point at the beginning, but it's worth emphasising. I certainly do not believe that a sense of a corrupt church or a disaffection with ecclesiastical power or whatever it is a cipher, is a disguise, and that actually these people really do believe, they're just pretending not to. Atheists don't believe in God, just as Christians do believe in God. So it's not an excuse for that, an alternative to it. The point is that obviously that belief in God is not something that just goes on up there. It's something that goes on throughout one's entire life and indeed an entire society. And therefore, atheism is tied up with social and political and cultural issues just as much as belief is. With regard to that point, that's undoubtedly the case. It allows me to kind of go back to a research project I did 12 years ago when I was here, called Beyond Belief, in which I interviewed 5 groups of effectively non-Christians. 3 groups had called themselves Christian in the 2001 census, 2 groups hadn't, to get an idea of why they didn't believe and what they didn't believe. And what emerged very clearly was a profound antipathy to the church, although in all fairness not always particularly informed antipathy. Certainly an antipathy to something that's amorphously called religion. But a willingness to give credit to the idea of God. And interestingly, even amongst the really critical groups, an unwillingness to criticize Jesus Christ. And that wasn't through any kind of piety, that was because he was one of the good guys. Everyone else that followed him for the last 2,000 years, wretched people, a lot of them. But he was good, because he kind of basically believes the same as I do. I'm exaggerating a bit. But you could pass the differences like that, and there was more resistance to, if you like, the way Christianity or belief in God incarnated itself in public than the theoretical idea itself.
Sorry, just hold on.
Sorry. So do you think that in some ways the church sort of perpetuates atheism in some ways by its own actions? Or, I mean, that's kind of similar to the question we had over there.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that, if you want to encapsulate the message of this book, it's bad believers make good unbelievers, really. There is a bit of that, undoubtedly, historically, without a doubt. I wrote an article for Third Way about this a couple of months ago, and I made the point that the most convincing response to atheism is not actually a Christian argument, it's a Christian life. Which doesn't mean that arguments aren't important and all the caveats need to, but you can win arguments hand down. If you're a morally ugly person, it's irrelevant, really. Having said that, I would also have to say that a lot of the criticisms that was levelled at the church was at least in this research, was nasty and ill-informed. So just because someone points a finger at it, it doesn't mean the finger is well pointed. And also what complicates matters massively here is that it's another monotheism that's got people's backs up in the last 15, 20 years here. It's Islam. Not exclusively, but to some large measure. And that has historically not been an issue in previous European history. It's fascinating, when the Quran is first being translated into the vernacular European languages in the 17th and 18th century, you have these free thinkers, as they were called, wrestling with Islam. Because Islam, on the one hand, is a great way to give the church a kicking through lots of reasons. So, question of moral relativism, and Pierre Bayle does this. I actually got it here. He has this great quote. Most of his quotes are great. He says, he wrote a dictionary in 1697, and he wrote in his entry on Muhammad that Muslims ignored the fundamentally violent tenet of their faith by tolerating other religions, whereas Christians ignored the fundamentally peaceful intent of their faith by persecuting others. It was a typical Bayle, a Bayle kind of response. So there was this confusion about Islam then, but it's much more of an issue now, and some, not all, but some of the anger from the New Atheist movement is because of what has been done in the name of Islamic religion rather than Christian religion.
Okay, who else? Time for a few more at the back there.
So at the end of your talk, you said about, I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but you said that the reason that atheism is on the rise is because God is on the rise, or something to that effect. Could you elaborate that on a bit more? Because I don't really see in the UK God on the rise that much on the whole. Well, I see atheism rising a lot.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's two kind of responses to that. First is that you can't simply look at a UK focus now. So in a globalised world, as we are endlessly being told it is, no social trends, no demographic trends or political or religious trends take notice of national boundaries. And globally, it is undoubtedly the case that religion is an actor today in a way that sociologists 2 generations ago didn't think it was going to be. Britain, you're entirely right, is one of the most secular, although that term is a very elastic term, countries. But that doesn't mean there isn't a religious presence there. I wrote the inaugural Theos report 7 or 8 years ago, Doing God. I picked up some analysis that The Guardian had done about the number of religious stories that they did in 1985, 1995 and 2005, and they doubled every year. So there was twice as many in 95 as there were in 85, and twice as many in 2005 as in 95, and I dare say maybe twice as many next year as there were in 2005. So even if religious attendance is declining in Britain, and we can argue about the data there, coverage of religion and awareness of religion and consciousness of religion, again using this ghastly umbrella term, is on the rise, even in Western Europe. And given the fact that historically atheism has thrived when you have examples of bad religion, bad religious practice, oppressive religious practice, that's the justification for my conclusion that we're going to see more of atheism because God is back, in terms of, in the way that Micklethwaite uses the term, politically and publicly, God is back. Does that help explain?
Okay. Anyone else?
Today, as well as atheism, there seems to be a lot of sort of apathy towards God, or sort of indifference, if you like. Would you say that's part of the same phenomena as the new atheism, or a separate thing?
Certainly not the same as the new atheism, because whatever one might say about new atheism, it's interested, it's engaged, it has a passion about this subject that very few religious believers do, to be honest with you. Historically, actually, a kind of general disengagement has been the default British response, really. And I think it probably still is. We're more engaged. You have to have an opinion on these matters more now than you would, say, 20 or 30 years ago. But I think the default position is still one more of disengagement rather than passion on either side. I think people in the middle sometimes look at people on either side, committed believers and committed non-believers, and think, what's all the fuss about? Why are you getting so excited? I think that the default position is still more towards the indifference.
So if you've got something like same-sex marriage, for example, is that not to do with atheism? It's more just to do with a kind of a liberalism or a tolerance or something, completely different completely?
Well, I wouldn't say same-sex marriage has got anything to do with atheism. It became a religious issue because the majority of groups that campaigned on it were religious, I think. But it's not a religious issue in the sense that it's a parliamentary issue, it's a legal issue, and it's simply an issue of how we order and constitute our laws. It's an interesting example of how all politics is morally freighted. So whether you are pro or against gay marriage, or pro or against budget cuts, you have that position because you have a certain view of how the world should be run, and that view should be informed by your personal beliefs, whether they're atheistic beliefs or religious beliefs. And in so-called, quote-unquote, personal political issues, so things like gay marriage, abortion, euthanasia, so on and so forth, those personal beliefs seem to be close to the surface, so it's easier to connect people's political position with their religious belief. But I certainly wouldn't want to see it as a religious or an atheistic issue. I think it's important we see all these things as political issues to which people bring their religious or atheistic commitments.
One here and then one at the back.
You said that you think we've passed the high water mark of the new atheism, and that we're into the new atheism. I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that. Perhaps you could just elaborate slightly. And then just looking a bit further forward, where next do you think atheism will go in this country?
So the first question, why I think it's passed, it's because I get the sense that, I'm going to be proved wrong here, that fewer people take the arguments that Dawkins, Harris, Dennett and Hitchens made as seriously as they did 10 years ago. And I got the impression, 2006, 7, 8, they were sweeping all before them, and now there's more hostility, more awareness of the philosophical thinness of a lot of what is being said. They've scored some pretty good points, and certainly very good polemical points, but a sense that the intellectual robustness of their arguments is not what people thought it was 7 or 8 years ago. But that doesn't mean, if people are slightly disaffected with new atheism, doesn't mean all of a sudden they become believers at all. And the new atheism, I think that is a ghastly term, but the kind of religious atheism, atheist churches, there's a great one. I haven't talked about atheist churches. The one opened up in Islington. They're all over the world now, apparently. I met Sanders and Jones who set them up. They're a great example. I mean, quite apart from the fact, the ethical union, the ethical movement, had atheist churches in this country 100 years ago, and the religion of humanity had them before then. One of the things that keeps on coming round. I sense that two things could happen. One, we could just dissolve back into indifference again and think, what was all that about? Why was everyone getting so excited? Or, if religion, in its various different forms, or bits of religion, continue to reassert itself in ways that it provokes a public reaction, then you're not going to see an end to hostility. So where atheism goes will depend in large measure on where religion goes. And at the moment, if you were going to take the temperature globally, it ain't looking too positive, really. So I see the new atheist phenomenon as being a bit of an early 21st century spasm, but I don't necessarily see the emotions that underlied it going away at all.
There was one at the back, and we'll make that the final one. Thank you.
Appears to be a sort of growth in spiritualism, sort of spiritualism in the broader sense, including sort of Buddhism, New Ageism, etc. Would you say that that's true in the UK, and if so, why that is the case?
So the growth of kind of amorphous, non-institutional religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs.
Yes, right.
Yeah, I mean the data were quite strong on this. That it's difficult to get very longitudinal data on this because the surveys have only really been conducted since the late 80s, if then. But you can get some, and Gallup, I think it was Gallup, did some surveys, some research in the 1950s, looking at the number of people who believed in ghosts and horoscopes. And the number of people who believe in them 50, 60 years later was much, much higher. And the general, if I can use this word non-pejoratively, because it is a pejorative word, credulousness, or willingness to embrace spiritual beliefs free from any institutional setting, is undoubtedly much greater now than it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. And from a Christian theological point of view, that makes a lot of sense. It's not that, we have an inbuilt desire for purpose and direction and significance and meaning and identity and all these things. And if we're not going to find them in institutional religion, we're jolly well going to find them somewhere else. And the other great location for these things, political religions, are even more out of favour than ecclesiastical religions. So I think there's a very significant increase in that. But the danger is that it becomes consumerised and it can, doesn't always work like this, but it can be the latest sophisticated consumer accessory. I've got the handbag and the t-shirt, now I've got the kind of feng shui kit.
Nick, just while you're still on your feet, if I might ask, for those of us here who are Christians this evening, what is the take-home thing for us for our ongoing engagement with friends who aren't Christians? What would you want to pass on to us? Very pragmatic utilitarian question.
I'm not utilitarian, Anthony. I can't stand. Well, what I wouldn't want you to say, and this isn't not, it's easy, first of all, aren't they? What I wouldn't want you to say is, I went to this talk, or I bought this book, and it says that, atheists are really kind of like this. So when you tell me all that stuff about Darwinism and higher criticism, you don't actually believe that. You just don't like oppressive people. That would be the wrong thing to do, because, to emphasise the point, believers don't believe, and believers believe, and non-believers don't believe. And they are kind of irreducible facts. So that's certainly the wrong approach. I guess the right approach is partly simply a question of understanding. I mean, we bang on as Christians about false representation of Christian history, rightly so. When you read something like God is not great, you do so with your head in your hand sometimes. Bonhoeffer wasn't a Christian, apparently. Martin Luther King wasn't a Christian. You think this is dreadful. From a really intelligent person, this is shameful. Christians aren't immune to that at all. And when you get this, Nazism was down to atheism line, it wasn't at all. And similarly, Jack's question, atheism naturally leads to communism. It doesn't. So I think it's incumbent on Christians, if Christians are asking people to be fair and judicious and reasonable in reading their history and not simply leapfrogging from the Crusades to the wars of religion, it's important that we show a similar respect. And part of that respect actually is it holds up the mirror to ourselves, and this will be my final point. There were times writing this book that I was on the atheist side, without doubt. And not just when the ecclesiastical situation in which they were operating was particularly grim, but some seriously intelligent, brave, thoughtful, decent people, Spinozas and maybe Hobbes and people like George Holyoake in the 19th century. And understanding better why people in history have had a problem with Christian belief, as it was for the most part, I think would probably help us, be perhaps a little more humble and a little better, better able to kind of shape our own lives in response.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. Please feel free to take your seat.